Welcome to Gothic versus Modern. We are very, very excited to have Paul Stirton here with us today. Paul has done a couple of talks for us, and actually his talk on Tschichold from a few years ago is our most popular talk on YouTube by a mile. No discredit to our other amazing speakers we've had. So if you love hearing Paul talk tonight, go onto our YouTube channel and look up his other talks. They're absolutely fantastic. If you don't know who I am, my name is Becky Chilcott, and I work here as a volunteer running the events programme, and I'm also a trustee of the fantastic St Bride Foundation, where we are here today. And if you didn't know, by buying a ticket to an event like this, you are helping fund the upkeep of this amazing Grade 2 listed Victorian building, management and conservation of our unique and irreplaceable library collections, and running of our print workshop and learning programme. So we really appreciate your support in any way. So thank you very much for helping us keep the lights on and going and running for future generations. It's always appreciated. So we are, as I've said, we are delighted to welcome Paul Stirton here today with us. Paul is Emeritus Professor of the Modern European Design History at Bard Graduate Centre and editor of West 86, a journal of decorative arts, design, history and material culture with the University of Chicago Press. He is the author of many books and exhibition catalogues, including Burne-Jones and William Morris, Designs for the Aeneid and Kelmscott Chaucer with the Fitzwilliam Museum, Is Mr. Ruskin Living Too Long?, Selected Writings of E.W. Goodwin on Victorian Architecture, Design and Culture with Juliet Kinchin, and also Jan Tschichold and the New Typography with Yale University Press, and NKF Pete Swartz Avant-Garde Catalogue for the Standard Cables 1927 to 1928. And of course here he's going to be speaking to us about Gothic versus Modern, Letterforms and Graphic Design in Weimar, Germany. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Paul to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky. Can you hear me quite clearly at the back? So the sound and everything is fine. Well, as Becky pointed out, I gave a talk here a few years ago on Jan Tschichold, and I think at that time, and when I organised the exhibition and wrote the book on Tschichold and his collection, I was very struck about the meeting between Tschichold and Rudolf Koch. But I think I adopted Tschichold's own interpretation of that meeting, that he'd somehow turned his back on a backward-looking or inward-looking approach to design and typography. And I think that was a rather glib view, or I felt it at the time, but of course I adopted it. Nevertheless, I've thought since then that there's possibly more to this, and rather than take Tschichold's retrospective reading of it, I wanted to think what the situation was like between 1922 and 1925. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So let me just get started. In 1922, the young calligrapher Jan Tschichold, a recent graduate of the Academy of Graphic Art and Book Design in Leipzig, made the trip across Germany to visit Rudolf Koch in Offenbach on the outskirts of Frankfurt. In fact, Tschichold made that trip twice that year. Having seen a recent exhibition of Koch's work, he was intrigued to see what Koch had to offer. Now, this in itself was not unusual. Koch was the presiding genius of Schriftkunst, lettering art, in Weimar, Germany, and his work, the community workshop that he had established, as well as his very individual nature, meant that he inspired people and attracted disciples. Visitors to Koch's studio often wrote that they were on a sort of pilgrimage. Now, although less well known outside Germany, Rudolf Koch was a celebrated figure, even beyond the specific world of calligraphy and typography. His rise to national preeminence began in 1906, when he was first employed by the Klingspor brothers, type founders. The period, therefore, between 1890 and the First World War saw the Klingspor brothers coming to the forefront of German type design, founding, and print culture. And they were at the forefront of a great innovation in German print culture, seen through George Hartmann at the Bauer Foundry, David Stempel at Frankfurt, all contributing to a lively, competitive and creative environment. But Klingspor signing up Koch was something distinctive. Koch was a calligrapher with little or no experience of the craft or translating letterforms into type. It was, nevertheless, an inspired move because it offered Koch the opportunity to collaborate with Klingspor's punch cutters and engravers, and thus preserve the integrity of his elegant hand lettering, which you can see on the screen at the moment. As reported in the Fleuron, Koch's collaboration with the staff at Klingspor ensured, and I quote, that the sparkle of the initial conception is still visible in the finished type. It shows in an indefinable but very real manner the living touch of the man. Now, Koch remained a firm believer in the role of calligraphy to train the hand and eye, but also it enabled him to enter into a partnership with industry, which did not compromise his craft ethos or his standards. As he wrote in 1910, modern production methods allowed for a creative interaction between hand and industrial processes, especially since hand lettering can better judge spacing and elegance of form. It was left to our day to rediscover type as an independent and self-satisfying artistic means of expression. If worked in this way, we again succeed in producing finely lettered books. Then undoubtedly, new artistic values have been created, which, as well as anything else, will contribute to the improvement and refinement of our lives. Koch was much given to rather grandiose statements about the role of the type designer, typographer, and printer, but I'll come back to some of these in a little while. The first of this product of this collaboration was Kochschrift, initially called Deutsche Schrift, but released by Klingspor in 1910. Although Koch had been working on it since first taking up broad-nibbed penwork in 1903, welding together, as he said, the essential details of the old Gothic and Schwabacher alphabets into a new and independent whole. So this was much celebrated at the time, and Das Plakat wrote, Kochschrift is the result of the study of different handwriting styles. We are talking here about a typeface which is drawn rather than written. Now, there's quite a lot to unpack here. First of all, Deutsche Schrift was a black letter face, something for which Koch was a strong advocate, believing that Gothic script was something essential to the German national or racial consciousness. I'll come back to this in a moment. The year after Kochschrift appeared, he wrote a coruscating article in the Archiv für Buchgewerbe on Jacob Grimm, one of the two brothers Grimm, who had already described Fraktur, black letter, as, quote, ugly, misshapen, tasteless, and barbarian. Koch replied that Grimm knew nothing about printing. Even later, he recalled the significance of black letter for German identity. To us, the German script is an expression of our curious and special German being, which cannot be described. The fact that foreigners generally reject this script, what they do not like to read it, is precisely what equates to its worth. What adds to its distinctiveness is that it incorporates the Nordic and the Gothic, which during the High Middle Ages reflected all the manifestations of life and in the process the style of writing itself. This Nordic Gothic essence is something only we Germans have retained in spite of the cosmopolitanism and enlightenment of the last few centuries. The German script, in its handwritten and printed form, should serve as evidence to everyone, even to ourselves, that God has special plans for us. It's quite hard to read, far less accept some of this stuff. But he goes on to say that he, in other words, God, does not want us to perish in the monotony of the so-called civilized world. Instead, it is up to us to meet our responsibilities in the world in our own way. Right, now we in Britain find it difficult to grasp, especially nowadays after a lifetime of reading and writing in Roman or Antiqua, that black letter or fraktur was regarded not just as an archaic survival by German nationalists, but also the most appropriate and efficient way of translating the German language into text. In fact, the dispute between Antiqua and fraktur letter forms had reached a peak just before the First World War, when it was debated for official government recognition at the Reichstag. Its supporters claimed that fraktur, or black letter, was more readable, it was easier on the eyes, it was more compact in printing and therefore more efficient, and the letter forms were more flexible for adjustment and development. They felt that Antiqua and all Roman letter forms had been fixed in stone and therefore showed no potential for improvement. Now, for Koch, it was also a transcendent medium that embodied the very poetry of experience. I have a few quotes by Koch here, but this is one that you might quite like. Like the dark, spicy scent of fir trees, like the blackbird calling through the evening, like the gently swaying grace of meadow grass, most glorious, most German, script we have ever loved you. Squalor. Now, part of this poetic, and I should say almost messianic view of black letter and its role in shaping a distinctive culture. Here we are. I've lost my place, I'm sorry. Were two related features of Koch's life and work. His intense, almost unbearable nationalism, coupled with his absolute religious devotion. In one of several autobiographical texts, he wrote, "Even as a boy, I wanted to become a proper German. I hated anything that was foreign, and even as I was growing up, I felt that this was a sign of true loyalty. I lacked the desire to travel to southern Europe and to the works of antiquity. The country and the works of the Germans were enough for me. I wanted to be something complete, a Nordic and a German. I was drawn to this kind of wonderful and reassuring union." Now, this was written quite late in his life, but it's quite an interesting recollection of his childhood adherence to certain values. Alongside this, Koch's profound Christian beliefs, as expressed through the Lutheran Church, was a key aspect of his life and work. I emphasize that it's the Lutheran Church here because this folds back into his nationalist sensibilities. Luther's split from the Church of Rome in the early 16th century was not only an important landmark in German national identity. His insistence on the German translation of the Bible to be printed in black letter type was equally seen as shaping influence on modern German culture. Now, this does not in any way diminish Koch's devotion. It merely confirms the ways in which his beliefs fold inwards to create a coherent system of design, nation, and religion. As his pupil Ernest Kellner wrote later, Koch's deep religious feeling was also shared by his whole family. The Bible was always held an important place in the home. It supplied the standard for everything that happened. I think we can get a hint of this domestic life governed by a devotion to the church, the German people and their traditions, and an almost messianic belief in the mission of the craftsman, in these silhouettes, das Leben einer Familie, the life of a family, cut paper images that were mostly produced just before and during the war, and later published in lithographs by Insel Verlag in 1934. After the outbreak of World War I, however, in 1915, Koch volunteered for an infantry regiment and served 3 years on the Russian front, the Western Front, and in Serbia, the experience of which, like that for many, had a profound effect on his entire worldview. As he wrote in his autobiography, "What I gained in experience by this period of my life is not to be expressed in words. But a careful observer of my work will notice the change that this period brought about in me." What it brought about was an intensification of his calligraphy and printmaking as he sought to make letter forms carry the full weight of meaning and emotion that he had sought to communicate. Having served 3 years in the front during the war, he found a much stronger means of expression. Koch himself wrote of this inspirational view of the arts in an article, "The Joy of Creative Work, a Confession." There are those among us who have that rare gift and the strange desire that compels them to seek a harmony between the visible world and the picture of the world that they carry enshrined in their hearts, the world of their emotions and their deepest feelings. Their aim is to fashion all visible things to which their artistic impulse has access in accordance with this inner vision. Now, this inner vision, I think, is a key element in much of this, because he sees that this is what links him to the expressionist tradition in Germany. His manuscripts of the period immediately after the war are extraordinary in their skill, their density, and perhaps above all in their expressiveness. Some are closely modelled on late medieval manuscripts, such as the St. Matthew that we can see here. But the 4 Gospel books are in themselves entirely handwritten and illuminated. But there are other and different examples of his virtuosic skill in calligraphy. This is one example, the Sermon on the Mount. A continuous text forming a cross in 1922. As he says at one stage, a real letterer does not need illustration. The writing can be so expressive that any concrete representation would lessen the effect it projects. Now, one of the sources for this new expressive phase was his turn to block books, the pre-Gutenberg type of printing in which text and illustration are cut into the plank, not the end grain of the wood, but text and imagery are cut together. And I'm showing you here the vision of Isaiah. But these were produced in a limited edition series from the private press that he set up with Rudolf Gerstung, the so-called Rudolfinischer Drucke. Now, this is a separate one of the Elijah, all from 1920 to 21. Now, the block book had already been the focus of expressionist printmaking, especially on the part of the Dresden-based group Die Brücke, whose manifestos celebrated the fact that they were exploring a sensibility that was distinctively Germanic or Nordic, and that their work and ideology was inspired by Northern European sources, notably Nietzsche and the Gothic, as it was interpreted by two famous cultural critics, Wilhelm Wöhringer and Karl Scheffler. Now, Wöhringer is probably quite well known to this audience. His key books were Abstraction and Empathy from 1907, but also Form in Gothic from 1911, which had proposed the view that Northern culture was fundamentally different, even opposed to Mediterranean culture. Where the Mediterranean was comfortable and physical, the Northern was introverted and neurotic. In Form in Gothic, Wöhringer had proposed that this identified many of these traits in Gothic architecture and more broadly in the medieval culture of Northern Europe. A similar thesis was put forward by Karl Scheffler in The Spirit of Gothic from 1917. Less well known as Wöhringer, but actually much more widely read at the time because it was published by Insel Verlag. And this served to popularize the identification of a united Germany with its late medieval heritage, especially that of the 15th and 16th century. Now, in the immediate post-war period, Koch sought to widen his influence and indeed to broaden his activities in the larger project of calligraphy, type design, and craft in general. This, for example, gives you some idea of his work in this, and indeed going on from it. This is a poster of an exhibition that he had prepared with his fellow craftspeople in Offenbach. Now, Koch also resumed his teaching at the Technical College in Offenbach, but he wanted to develop this into a full arts and crafts workshop or community. With this in mind, he formed around himself a small group of artist craftspeople that developed throughout the 1920s. So what began as the Offenbacher Schreiber group, the calligraphy group, it expanded into the Offenbacher Werkstatt, or workshop, teaching embroidery, punch cutting, silversmithing, mural painting, and tapestry. I'm showing you two examples, again employing biblical texts, which had been partly woven by nuns from a nearby convent. In fact, Koch had become such a figurehead for this craft revival and that alignment of nation, church, and craft that he became fed up with people writing to him, hoping to get examples of his calligraphy. So he prepared a small woodcut text that could easily be printed and sent instead of a reply. It says, "Lick my arse." In this widening craft project, Koch was inspired by, of course, William Morris. And in 1925, he wrote the first of several essays on the English founder of the arts and crafts movement, stating, "We Germans cannot get over the fact that William Morris was English. To us, he seems as un-English as Shakespeare seems English. He belongs to us Germans more than anyone else." So you get some idea of what this involved. This, therefore, was the figure and the environment that the young Jan Tschichold was seeking to join in 1922. Just 20 years old and a new graduate of the Akademie für Grafische Kunst und Buchgewerbe, the Academy of Graphic Art and Book Industry in Leipzig, he was in many respects already a disciple. Two scrapbooks in the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek in Leipzig of his early work show the extent to which Tschichold was following Koch's lead in calligraphy and letterforms. In an even more explicit debt to Koch's recent work, in 1922 to 23, Tschichold began using colour washes in the bowls and loops of his hand-drawn letterforms, as Koch had begun in his evangelist books of 1920 to 21. Since his 2 visits to Offenbach had been in 1922, we might assume that Tschichold continued to follow Koch's lead in some matters. However, in that very year, the ground was shifting in German art and visual culture, nowhere more so than in the area of printing and typography. In 1922, there were 2 congresses of Constructivists and Dadaists. The first in Düsseldorf in May and the second in Weimar in September, from which emerged several reports and manifestos, the gist of which was that this group had set their face against expressionism as a movement and as a representative form to reflect modern life. In the declaration from the first Congress, I'm quoting these 2 statements, items 2 and 6, the new spirit is characterized by the effort to reject the subjective, visionary view of the world and establish the universally unambiguous and real. And item 6, the new art is built on a foundation that is not subjective but general, that is determinative like science and constructive in nature. The artist is a companion of the scholar, the engineer, and the worker. Now, the manifesto, in fact, of the Constructivist International following the Congress claimed to create a new way of shaping life in keeping with our contemporary consciousness, using universal means of expression. What they went on to say was, in contrast to all subjective, predominantly emotionally oriented art production, individual initiative is no longer sufficient to carry out the tasks of modern life. Now, 7 of the people in this Constructivist Congress would go on to write specific manifestos on typography and letterforms. You might be able to recognize some of them. Standing in the middle with a copy of his own magazine tucked in his hat is Theo van Doesburg of the De Stijl group. Behind him, to his right, with a hat and a pipe on, that's L. Lissitzky. Kurt Schwitters wasn't there that day. I'm not sure where he was, but he was at the Congress. And right at the back, on our right-hand side, is László Moholy-Nagy. Standing over on the left-hand side with a child on his shoulders is Max Burckhardt. And at the front, poking Hans Arp with a stick, is Graf Trump. And Werner Greff, it's Greff on the ground. All of which indicates how important print, and especially type and typography, were felt to be in the creation of a new constructivist and Dadaist sensibility. This, therefore, is the beginning of a torrent of manifestos, statements, publications, laying out the new terms of modern typography. First out of the blocks was L. Lissitzky, resident in Germany between 1922 and 1927, and acting really as an emissary of the Soviet avant-garde. These are 3 of his early publications, including his issue of März, which I think is one of the best of the new typography publications in the early 20s. He was closely followed by Kurt Schwitters, editor, founder of März, in which he, of course, devoted an entire issue to typographic advertising, which you can see. And of course, there was László Moholy-Nagy, best seen here in the catalogue to the Staatliche Bauhaus Weimar exhibition of 1923. This catalogue design must have been one of the first things that Moholy undertook at the Bauhaus because he'd only joined the staff 2 months before the exhibition opened. In these early years, the school had no letterpress or typography workshop on site, so all graphic design was printed using lithography, intaglio, or relief work. Some materials were produced at an external press with whom the specification were shared, but typeface selection was limited to what the printer had on hand. The effect of this can be seen in the disharmony between text and illustration in most of the Bauhaus Weimar publications, not least the Manifesto and Prospectus of 1919. For the privately published folios of prints that you can see here on the left, or the magazine Utopia, that was left to the individual artist craftspeople to develop their own combinations of type and hand-drawn lettering. In Utopia, it was Johannes Itten who collaborated with his student Friedel Dicker, and she's credited with typesetting and directing this rather curious piece of printing, translating Itten's wild sketches into typographic form. Dicker uses fracture and black letter faces expressively, freely mixing typefaces within sentences, sometimes even words. And I would suggest that you might look upon this as a form of expressionism, the broader movement that we may think of at its peak in Die Brücke and Der Blaue Reiter before the war. But remember that major plays, films, and other artistic expressions were very much at the forefront, dominating German cultural life during this period. After the move to Dessau, some of the technical limitations were overcome. The school finally had its own letterpress workshop and stock of metal type. It was only then that the institution could better express its design and typographic sensibilities. Moholy-Nagy worked closely with Gropius to create many of their publications, notably the Bauhaus magazine, which you can see the banner headline for here, demonstrating a progressively simplified and systematic typography. I've found it very difficult to follow up much of the research on Bauhaus equipment and typography, and indeed recently I've said a number of things that the Bauhaus did not have printing presses to address many of the issues of the new typography. And from recent correspondence, this picture on the left, I think, is the only photograph of the Bauhaus Druckerei print workshop, which was sent to me by the Bauhaus Archive. But if you want to know more about that, you could listen to my earlier talk on YouTube, in which I lay out some of the problems of the presses and the fact that there was some form of rivalry between the Bauhaus and the Cranach press, both based in Weimar at the same time. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. What did the young Jan Tschichold make of this? Well, we know in little of his immediate responses to his 2 visits to Koch's workshop in 1922. Tschichold was still working in a manner similar to Koch in 1923, but over the following year, he underwent a radical conversion to the constructivist avant-garde. He may have seen the Great Russian Art Exhibition in Berlin in 1922, or picked up any of the various journals and manifestos with which the emerging group of new typographers broadcast their work and ideas. We know he attended the Bauhaus exhibition in 1923, And in later life, he wrote that he could not be a follower of Koch because Koch was, quote, too narrowly Germanic and historical in outlook, and consequently out of step with the complex philosophy of the cultivated person in the present day. Now, we might therefore see these years, 1922 to 1925, as a pivot, a key moment in the climate of modernity in Central Europe, in which the avant-garde shifted their interests from an emphasis on extreme personal expression to the new objective and abstract possibilities. In this new environment, Tschichold was clearly excited by these possibilities, but in the absence of any coherent organisation, he began writing to the main protagonists and assembling a number of theoretical statements, the examples of the new work. This was ready by late 2024 and would appear in print as a special number of Typographische Mitteilungen, typographical studies, the monthly journal of the Union of Book Printers. Now, the theme was Elementartypographie, elemental typography, not elementary typography, and including statements and illustrations by a number of the avant-garde artist designers who were listed on the cover. And from these various manifestos, rather like commandments, we can simplify the main views into a few statements. The new typography is purposeful. Since the purpose of typography is communication, the message must appear in its shortest, simplest, and most urgent form. The elemental means of typography are, if it's not obvious already, letters, numbers, signs, and rules from the typecase. This includes the precise image, which must be only photography, and the elemental letter form, sans serif. To increase the urgency and sensational effect of the new typography, vertical and diagonal line directions can be used simultaneously. And of course, elemental design excludes the use of any ornament. Now let's just look at that cover again. The message must appear in its shortest, simplest, and most urgent form. The elemental means of typography are letters, numbers, signs, and rules. There is no photography, but the elemental letter form is sans serif. And the urgency and sensational effect of the new typography means that vertical and diagonal line directions can be used simultaneously. Now, it should be remembered that radical as these ideas were, it was being circulated to a vast specialised readership. In 1927, there were over 80,000 members of the Book Printers Union in Germany. I haven't been able to ascertain whether all members received copies of the journal, but there can be no doubt that the new ideas were reaching into every print workshop, type foundry, and publisher in the land. And it generated much debate amongst printers, designers, etc., regarding the the meanings, symbolism, and above all, perhaps, the political affiliations of the different typefaces. Sans serif quickly became the letter form of the left in Germany. It was noticeable. Sorry, I meant to keep that up. It was noticeable that Jan, or Johannes Tschichold, changed his name on the cover to Ivan Tschichold. And Walter Dexel, many others, campaigned for the abandonment of uppercase lettering, the use of lowercase only. This was part of an ongoing debate in Germany regarding efficiency in reading, writing, and printing. Especially important, since in German all nouns are capitalized. But as the historian and critic Franz Roh wrote, why do we need two letters for the same sound? But the political dimension was perhaps best seen in Walter Dexel's comment, which I think bears fair relation to the French Jacobins. His view was that uppercase letters were an indulgence equivalent to having an aristocracy, and they should therefore be abolished or wiped out. Now, to meet this rising demand, several foundries were already commissioning new sans serifs for both display and reading faces, the most famous being Erbar, which was released in 1926, closely followed by Paul Renner's Futura, produced by the Bauer Foundry in 1927. And you'll see Bauer's promoted Futura by its alignment with the principles of the new typography. It was lent itself to asymmetrical layout. It was well integrated with photographic text, and it came in various weights and indeed different forms that would allow greater flexibility. Now, Koch had actually also introduced a sans serif in this period, cable, one which was extremely popular. But one senses from his statements that he regarded it as a novelty, most useful as a display face, never to challenge the black letter faces for reading. He had already designed probably the most successful of the expressive display types, Neuland, which was produced by Klingspor in 1923. But this could not be regarded as in any way equivalent to the role that he regarded his Fraktur typefaces to perform, especially Deutsche Schrift, as we've said. Now, if the expressionist and black letter typographers still had a high profile in the mid-1920s, a few key publications indicate how the new typography made headway. First among these was Tschichold's Die Neue Typographie in 1928, published again by the Union of Book Printers. This, of course, was described at the time as a handbook, a manual, not a theoretical text, but it's riddled with political statements aligning Tschichold's, or demonstrating Tschichold's alignment with the German Communist Party. But it was most unusual, nevertheless, although the sans serif faces were proclaimed by the new typographers as having universal application, offering new ways of reading and using letter forms, it was most useful as a display face in this, as seen, for example, in this poster by Max Burkhardt for a dance festival. So these grand claims for sans serif and lowercase really didn't stand up to universal application. But it's also seen in the ways that sans serifs were normalized or integrated into familiar publications, albeit many of a progressive nature, like Die Form. This was the magazine of the Deutsche Werkbund, launched in 1922 with a calligraphic headline, then relaunched in 1925 with a cover by Hust Schmidt. And then finally in 1928, they had a competition, which was won by Walter Dexel, were probably the most extreme and outstanding example of the new typography. We can see something similar in Gefesselter Blick, so-called captured glance, produced in 1930 and related to an exhibition sponsored by the Swiss Werkbund. The late 20s and early 30s was a great period for international design exhibitions, especially in Germany, as the economy recovered somewhat after the inflations and collapses of the period between 1921 and 24. And since many of these exhibitions were at least supported by the national or regional Werkbunds, we might find that the new typography is at the forefront. So the landmark exhibitions were Pressa in Cologne in 1928, Film and Photo in Stuttgart 1929, Wohnung und Werkraum in Breslau of 1929, with again an outstanding photo montage poster, in this case by Johannes Moltzahn on the bottom right, and Kunst der Werbung in Essen, and finally Photomontage in Berlin, 1931. Now, this is to say nothing of the activities of the Ring, the famous group, the Ring of new advertising designers set up by Kurt Schwitters and Robert Michel in 1927. They held exhibitions across Germany and the Netherlands to promote the new typography, but they were not seen by large groups. They were seen mostly by other practitioners. Now, as I'm sure everyone in this audience knows, this seemingly all-conquering constructivist typography was brought to a shuddering halt in April 1933 with the full rise to power of the Nazi Party. On the one hand, leading figures in the new typography were sacked or imprisoned, not least Jan Tschichold himself, and others were forbidden to publish in officially sanctioned journals or books. Almost immediately, the Nazis enforced Fraktur as standard for government publications and school books, and what was called Kurrentschrift was taught in handwriting. Favoured faces were not true Fraktur or Schwabacher scripts, but a form of textura, usually with nationalistic names, Deutschland, National, Tannenberg, or Gothenburg. They were collectively known as Schaftstiefel grotesque, jackboot grotesque. You can see it here in using Deutschland in a, well, I'm sure you can recognise the car, an early advert for what became known as the Volkswagen. Now, it's therefore rather odd to find in 1941, in fact, on the 3rd of January, a sudden announcement by Martin Bormann forbidding Fraktur, as he wrote, as Schwabacher Judenlettern. It's incorrect to consider or describe the so-called Gothic script as a German script. In reality, the so-called Gothic script consists of Schwabacher Jewish type. Just as Jews later acquired control of newspapers, Jews living in Germany acquired control of printing presses, leading to the widespread adoption of Schwabacher Jewish type in Germany. Today, the Führer decided that Antiqua typefaces should henceforth be designated as the standard typeface. Gradually, all printed materials are to be converted to the standard typeface. Now, the generally accepted interpretation of this directive has nothing to do with Judenlettern, but more likely intended to enable clearer communication and propaganda directed at the subject countries in Europe, which were now controlled by Nazi Germany and had great difficulty in reading Fraktur. If sans serif had become associated with the left in the 1920s due to the larger socio-political project that the new typography had proclaimed, the Second World War indelibly placed black letter fonts in the camp of the Nazis. The very deliberate policies of internationalism adopted by both East and West Germany after the war, however, meant that Roman script, or Antiqua, was adopted in almost all printed forms, from school books to commercial advertising. And I take as an example of this Hans Leistikow, who was the city designer in Frankfurt and a very interesting graphic designer in his own right, although most of his best work was done with his sister. He was a very committed communist and prepared the designs for Frankfurt using a block type simplification of the eagle and sans serif typeface. In 1933, he left and spent the next 12 years in the Soviet Union, during which time Frankfurt returned to its much more explicit symbol of Frankfurt with claws thrown out. On his return to Frankfurt in 1945, Lissitzky was put back in charge of the civic identity of Frankfurt, and he went back to sans serif, antiqua, and also the slab-like design. Now, we've come quite a long way from Tschichold's visit to Koch in 1922, but I want to just recall that moment, which I see as pivotal in our understanding of type and graphic design history. Koch must have seemed so well suited to an age in which German identity was under question, and there was a dire need for a recovery of will as well as economics after the First World War. But Koch's ecstatic view of the conjunction of the craft of calligraphy, the Lutheran Church, and what he saw as German destiny expressed through black letter typography was already becoming out of step with an emerging internationalism that brought together an equivalent cluster of associated meanings in the universalism of left-wing politics, the glamour of constructivist art and ideas, and the practice of the new typography. It is nevertheless that drama that makes German typography and graphic design in the 20th century so absolutely consuming and, to me at least, very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was absolutely fascinating. We do have time for a few questions if anyone has them for Paul. Anyone at all? Oh, yes. Okay, I'll come over.
Hi there. I really enjoyed the lecture. Thank you very much. The visual material is incredible. With some of the typographic work that included non-typographic elements, what was the combination? Was any of that printed in a frame, or would it have been a combination of lithography or some kind of lithographic process with typesetting kind of impressed on it? Do you know what the techniques were?
For at least in the new typography with their bold slab effect, we're told, and that in some cases you can see it, it was locking together the space bars. So when they were printed using letterpress, locking together the space bars into these quite elaborate combinations of shapes, if I can.
The space bar that would have been used to space out the lettering.
To space out the lettering and the line spacing.
Yeah.
But clearly, I'm losing my references as well as my marbles. Here we are, right. But typographische Mitteilungen with 80,000 copies couldn't be printed that way. Yeah. So the principles were developed using the space bars, but it was transferred to photolithography by this stage. There's a lot of deception in all of this, that much of Koch's work, which was developed using woodcut and calligraphy, were often transferred to lithographic reproduction for when there was a large run. His books, they were only in editions of 200, so they were printed on a hand press or an intaglio press, a relief printing press. But there are some examples where you can actually see the lines between the space bars when they've been locked together and the ink hasn't remained consistent. But that's quite rare. And it's quite hard, even with a magnifying glass, working out the processes of printing. But another thing I've not really referred to in this is that this was a period of great innovation in the technology of printing. Above all, in the use of photolithography, which had been known before the First World War, but it accelerated in the 1920s, particularly as the German printing industry got back on its feet and sought to reassert its position at the forefront of European printing. So there's a lot of development in photolithography and its different applications. What Moholy-Nagy described at one stage as typophoto, this integration of text. So most of Moholy-Nagy's books, which I didn't really show any here, I don't think I did. Did I? No, I don't. Well, I didn't show any of the Bauhaus books, but yeah. But he drew the lines in, so they weren't made with space bars, and it was then photographically transferred to a lithographic printer. In fact, the Bauhaus fibs all the time about their printing methods. They sent most of it out to a printer in Munich called Meyer. And so all that was really done, it was prepared on a drawing board in Dessau and in Weimar and sent off to Munich to be printed and bound. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just a bit much when you're talking about training up a generation of new graphic designers, none of whom were allowed near a press. So
Very good, thank you.
Does anyone else have a question?
I do have a question.
Oh, there you go. Sorry, I couldn't see that.
Hi there. Is there any evidence that there was any of the dissenters who were dissenting in the middle of the 30s as the Iron Boot came down in Germany, that they were using any particular style or any particular production method to produce pamphlets and things like those kind of things? Are there any existing pamphlets and things designed in this period?
Yes, there are. All that the party and the Reichskommission for Printing, which basically was a censorship agency, all that they could cover really was official government publications, and they're not very consistent with that. Let me see where. This, for example, these are official government publications with you can see the swastika on them, and they give you an indication of the flexibility. But most of the new typographers, although many of them, like Lestikov, went to the Soviet Union, I can't remember, one or two went to America. Interestingly, very few of them went to America. The Bauhaus people did, but very few of the Ring went to America. And most of them also went back to Germany afterwards. Quite a few went underground, but not in any form of resistance. I just mean by that they began working locally. Was it Dexel or Maltzahn who became a curator? One became I can't remember, became a curator in a regional museum and produced very interesting typographic catalogues for his museum, but they had very limited circulation. The idea of a resistance or an underground, it was very much, if it was politically motivated, it was very much samizdat and quite crudely produced. And one of the features of the new typography was their claim that they were embracing new technology at its most advanced and sophisticated level. So you couldn't get access to these presses and that distribution network, which was entirely controlled by the party. I hope that's on. Yeah.
Any further questions? It's clearly time for the pub or a drink or go home. So if anyone would like to carry on the conversations, we have got a few drinks still left at the back that are complimentary, but we will be, a few people I'm sure will be going to the Crown and Sugarloaf just over near Fleet Street if you would like to carry on the conversations. But more importantly, thank you very much, Paul. It's been fantastic to have you here. Thank you.